My name is Amelia and I am 28 years old. I drove 3 hours from Nashville to my grandmother's farm on the morning of her 80th birthday, expecting to find folding tables set up in the backyard, the smell of pot roast coming through the screen door, and maybe a hand-painted banner someone had taped crookedly above the porch. What I found instead was a silent property, the faint sound of cicadas in the tree line, and a single piece of notebook paper taped to the front door with a strip of masking tape. Before I tell you what happened next, there is something you need to know, something my family never once thought to consider. For the past 4 years, I have worked as an estate planning attorney in Nashville. I draft wills and trusts. I set up powers of attorney. I also spend roughly a third of my time on contested estate litigation, cases where a family member has quietly helped themselves to assets that were never theirs. I know every method. I know every paper trail. I know every single tell that gives a fraud away. My uncle didn't know what I did for a living. He called me the little legal secretary at Thanksgiving dinner last year, right in front of everyone, laughing at his own joke. He was about to learn the difference. The note on the door was written in his handwriting, that loose, impatient cursive that always looked like he was in a hurry to be somewhere else. He and my aunt had taken a last-minute cruise out of Miami for the week. A little birthday treat for themselves he'd written, which I read twice because I was almost certain I'd misunderstood. He'd listed my grandmother's medication schedule in bullet points at the bottom. He noted that the neighbor's teenager would bring in the mail. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He didn't even sign his name, he just wrote back Sunday. I stood on that porch for a long moment with the paper in my hand. My grandmother had lived on this land for 52 years. She and my late grandfather had built the original 2-room farmhouse themselves and expanded it over the decades until it became the 3-bedroom home where my father and my uncle grew up. My grandfather passed 6 years ago. After that, my grandmother's name was the only name on the deed. At least, that was what I had always assumed. I went inside. She was in her rocking chair in the front room, facing the window that looked out over the back field. She had a crocheted blanket over her lap even in the July heat, and the television was off. A glass of sweet tea sat on the side table, long gone warm. The pill organizer on the kitchen counter had each compartment labeled in my aunt's handwriting. The whole house had the particular quiet of a place that had been very carefully arranged to look a certain way. I said her name softly, the way I had learned to say it over the past year and a half. Careful, gentle. Because for 18 months my uncle had been telling the whole family that she was slipping, forgetting conversations, repeating herself, leaving burners on. He had arranged for a home health aide to come 3 days a week. He had taken over her finances, her bills, her doctor's appointments. He told everyone it was the least he could do. He said she needed someone looking out for her. She turned from the window. And the eyes looking back at me were not the eyes I had been visiting for a year and a half. They were not soft or searching or slightly lost. They were dark and sharp and entirely present, and they were looking at me the way she used to look at me when I was 7 years old and tried to sneak cookies before supper, like she could see clean through me and found the whole situation mildly amusing. "Did he send you?" she asked. I said, "He left a note, he's on a cruise." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Then she folded the crocheted blanket across the arm of the chair with deliberate, precise movements, and she sat up straight and she said, "Good, sit down. I've been waiting for him to leave long enough to talk to you." My heart was doing something strange in my chest. I sat on the edge of the sofa. "I need you to understand something first," she said. "I am not losing my mind. I have not been losing my mind. I started acting like I was 14 months ago because I needed to know exactly how far your uncle was willing to go." She held my gaze. "Now I know." The silence in that room was very loud. I have spent 4 years sitting across from people in impossible situations. I have learned to keep my face still and my voice level no matter what I hear. I used that skill for everything it was worth right then. I said, "Tell me what you found." She told me. Over the next hour, my grandmother laid out 14 months of quiet, methodical observation from a woman who had spent her entire adult life managing a household, keeping farm accounts by hand, and tracking every dollar that moved through her property. She had noticed the first irregularity herself, A property tax notice that arrived addressed to something called Whitmore Land Holdings LLC, a name she had never heard. She'd asked my uncle about it, and he'd told her she was confused. Said the letter must have gone to the wrong address. Said she shouldn't worry about those things anymore. That was the moment she decided to start worrying about everything. She showed me where she kept them. A shoebox pushed to the back of the closet in the spare bedroom, filled with mail she had quietly intercepted over 14 months. Bank statements, letters from a mortgage company, a document she'd found left on the kitchen table one evening, when she was supposed to be asleep, written in my uncle's handwriting, that she'd photographed with her phone and slipped back exactly where she found it. He had gotten careless. People with dementia don't read their own mail, or so he had assumed. I went through every piece of paper in that box. My hands were steady, the rest of me was not. My uncle had filed a durable power of attorney for property and financial management 11 months ago, using documents notarized at a UPS store 2 counties over. My grandmother's signature was at the bottom. I looked at it for a long time, the letter formation, the pen pressure, the way the loop in her last name sat lower than it should. I have reviewed hundreds of signatures in contested estate cases. That signature was not hers. Using that fraudulent power of attorney, he had opened a home equity line of credit against the farm, $260,000 secured against land that 3 generations of her family had worked before she ever married into it. He had also changed the beneficiary designation on her retirement accounts, naming Whitmore Land Holdings LLC as the sole transfer on death recipient. The LLC I already knew before I even checked would have no operating purpose. It was a vessel, a container designed to hold whatever he planned to collect. The most recent letter in the shoebox was dated 11 days earlier. It was from a commercial real estate broker in Knoxville, referencing an active listing agreement for the farm property. 300 acres including the farmhouse and 2 outbuildings, and confirming that a buyer had been identified. Closing was tentatively scheduled for the following Friday. My grandmother watched me set that letter down. "He's selling the farm," I said. "He's trying to," she said. I looked at her across the coffee table. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" "Because I needed proof first," she said. "And because I needed you here without him knowing why. The moment he suspects someone with a law degree has seen these papers, he shreds everything he can reach and claims I gave him permission." She looked at me steadily. "He doesn't know what you actually do, Amelia. He thinks you push papers at a desk somewhere. He doesn't know you spend your days handling exactly this kind of case." I thought about my uncle at Thanksgiving, laughing with a fork in his hand, telling everyone at the table that I'd chosen a boring field. I thought about the way my aunt had smiled along. Neither of them had ever once asked what kind of law I practiced. I pulled out my phone and called August Pierce. August had been my grandmother's family attorney for 31 years. He was 70, semi-retired, ran a 2-person firm above a hardware store in the next town over, and had one of the sharpest legal minds I had ever sat across from. He also had no tolerance whatsoever for fraud. When I told him my grandmother was sitting in front of me and needed him, he said, "Give me 40 minutes. He arrived in 38. While we waited, I worked. My grandmother had a laptop on the writing desk in the corner. She had always been far more comfortable with technology than anyone gave her credit for. I pulled up the county property records database and searched the farm parcel. The deed had been transferred 6 weeks ago. Grantee Whitmore Land Holdings LLC. The grantor signature was my grandmother's, it wasn't. I cross-referenced the notarization seal, same UPS store, same notary ID number as the power of attorney. He had been using the same notary for almost a year, likely someone who hadn't understood what they were certifying or someone who hadn't cared. August came through the front door, stopped when he saw my grandmother sitting straight and clear-eyed in her chair and took a slow breath. "Opal," he said. "August," she said, "I've been better, but I've also been a lot worse." He sat down and I laid everything out on the coffee table, the bank statements, the LLC's registration, the fraudulent deed, the broker's letter about Friday's closing, and the forged power of attorney. I walked him through each item the way I'd walk a client through evidence, because that was exactly what this was. August listened without interrupting. He picked up each document carefully. He looked at the signature on the power of attorney for a long time without speaking. Then he said, Do you want to know what I think, or do you want to know what we're going to do? Both, I said. What we did over the next several hours. August contacted a judge he had practiced before for 2 decades and filed for an emergency injunction to halt Friday's closing. The grounds were fraudulent conveyance, elder financial exploitation, and a forged instrument. The injunction was supported by a sworn affidavit from my grandmother, signed with her actual signature, stating that she had never authorized the property transfer, never executed a legitimate power of attorney, and had been deliberately performing cognitive decline for 14 months in order to document her son's conduct. I filed a report with the Tennessee Adult Protective Services and a parallel complaint with the Financial Crimes Unit of the State Attorney General's Office. I contacted the county recorder's office to flag the property record against any further transfers pending investigation. Then I worked backward through the LLC formation documents to identify every account the fraudulent POA had touched. Then my phone rang. My uncle's number, a little cruise ship emoji my aunt had apparently added to his contact at some point. My grandmother held out her hand for the phone. I switched it to speaker and gave it to her. "Hey," she said, and her voice changed, softer, slightly slowed, the performance back in place like she'd just slipped on a coat she knew well. "Oh, it's so nice to hear your voice." His voice came through with background noise behind it, music and ice clinking somewhere. He asked if I had made it out, asked how things were going. There was no warmth in it. It was the voice of a man confirming a package had arrived. Then he said almost offhand that he needed her to do one small thing for him. An email would come to the house account. Just a transfer authorization form, totally routine. She just needed to print it, sign it, scan it back. He said she didn't need to read it carefully, it was just account maintenance. She said, "All right, honey, I'll look for it." He thanked her. He told her to have Amelia help with the printer if she needed it. He hung up. My grandmother set the phone on the coffee table. The softness left her voice immediately. She looked at August. "He's trying to push the final account transfer through before he gets home," she said. "He thinks he needs one more signature." August was already on his laptop. He won't get it. When that authorization request hits the bank, it'll be flagged by the fraud alert we're filing in the next 20 minutes. I thought about where my uncle was right then, on a ship somewhere in the Gulf, sunburned, unhurried, completely certain everything was handled. He had left a woman he believed was mentally failing, supervised by a niece he believed was professionally inconsequential, in a house he had already legally stolen on paper. He thought Friday's closing would go through. He thought when he came home Sunday he would step into a situation fully concluded in his favor. He didn't know his mother had never stopped being sharp. He didn't know she had spent 14 months building a case. He didn't know the niece he'd dismissed at Thanksgiving had spent 4 years doing nothing but exactly this kind of litigation, had filed emergency injunctions before, and knew how to move faster than he could cover his tracks. The injunction was granted Thursday morning. On Sunday afternoon, a rental car crunched up the gravel driveway and my uncle and aunt stepped out looking tan and rested. My aunt was carrying a tote bag with a cruise line logo on it. My uncle had his sunglasses pushed up on his head. They walked toward the front porch and he reached into his pocket for his keys. I watched from the window until he tried the lock twice. Then I went to the door. He looked at me the way people look at furniture that has been moved without their permission. "What happened to the lock?" he said. "I changed it," I said. He made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Amelia, it's 100 degrees, let us in." "I can't do that, you're not authorized to enter this property." Something shifted in his expression. He looked at me differently now, recalibrating, searching for the angle. "What are you talking about? This is Mom's house." "It was," I said. "You transferred it to your LLC 6 weeks ago using a forged deed. A judge reversed that transfer on Thursday and restored my grandmother's title. There's also a hold on every account you accessed through the fraudulent power of attorney you filed last year." My aunt had gone very still on the porch steps behind him. My uncle's voice went cold. He told me I had no idea what I was talking about. He told me he had legal authority over her finances. He told me she couldn't manage them herself. "She was managing them fine," I said. "She was also collecting evidence against you for 14 months while you thought she wasn't paying attention." He stared at me. Then the door opened wider behind me and my grandmother stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a clean blouse, her hair set, her posture straight. She looked at her son with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something far past disappointment, something in the territory of the particular grief that comes from having been right about something you desperately wished you'd been wrong about. He said her name. It came out like the beginning of an excuse. Don't, she said, just that one word. My uncle turned back to me and made the calculation I had been half expecting. He pulled out his phone and called the police. He told the dispatcher that his niece had changed the locks without permission and was refusing to let him into the property. He gave the address. He said it was urgent. He hung up looking briefly satisfied. Let the officers sort it out, he said. They arrived 11 minutes later. 3 deputies from the county sheriff's office, unhurried, no lights running. My uncle moved toward them immediately, explaining, gesturing, performing. One of the deputies waited until he finished. Then the deputy asked my uncle to confirm his full name. My uncle did. The deputy told him there was a warrant for his arrest, filed by the state attorney general's office in coordination with the county financial crimes unit, on charges including elder financial exploitation, forgery of a legal instrument, fraudulent conveyance of real property, and wire fraud. My uncle stopped talking. The deputy looked past him at my aunt. He told her there was a second warrant. She had been listed as a co-member on the LLC documents and had signed as a witness to my grandmother's supposedly authentic signature on the power of attorney. She was not a bystander, she was a signatory. The Attorney General's office had made that determination, after reviewing the notarized records. My aunt sat down hard on the porch step. She started crying. The kind of crying that doesn't have any composure in it. She said she hadn't known how bad it was, that she thought it was just borrowing, that he'd told her it was all legal and temporary. Maybe some of that was true. The courts would determine how much. My uncle did not cry. He stood very still while the deputy told him to turn around. He did. The handcuffs closed in the Sunday afternoon heat, and my grandmother stood on her own porch and watched it happen without looking away once. The following months moved the way legal proceedings do, in concentrated bursts and long stretches of paperwork. The LLC was dissolved, the fraudulent deed was voided and my grandmother's title restored in full. The home equity line was unwound through fraud findings and bank cooperation. The retirement account designations were corrected. The forensic accounting report traced $480,000 in aggregate transfers from her accounts to the LLC over 11 months. My uncle's defense argued ambiguity, that the paperwork had been a misunderstanding, that he had believed he was acting in her best interest. The jury heard the document examiner's testimony about the forged signatures. They heard my grandmother testify. She sat in the witness box in a navy blouse, answered every question clearly, and did not waver. She looked nothing like a woman who had been unable to manage her own affairs for a year and a half. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been paying close attention the entire time. The judge sentenced my uncle to 8 years in federal prison. My aunt received 4 years probation, mandatory restitution, and a permanent prohibition on serving in any fiduciary capacity. The prosecutor addressed the distinction directly in her closing statement. My aunt had been complicit, but she had also been the first to voluntarily provide financial records that corroborated my grandmother's account and filled evidentiary gaps. Cooperation had consequences and it had value. The court weighed both. August filed the final trust documents the week after sentencing. My grandmother asked me to serve as trustee and executor. I tried to suggest she consider someone with more professional distance from the situation. She looked at me the way she had looked at me on that first morning in July, the one where she folded the blanket off her lap and told me to sit down. "You found the shoebox," she said. "You're the trustee. The farm is still hers. She still gets up before 6 and walks the back field before the heat settles in. The trust structure I put in place means no one can move, encumber, or transfer a single acre without independent legal review and her explicit verified consent. Co-trustee provisions from August's firm provide an additional layer. Every door that needed locking is locked. I drive out from Nashville once a month, sometimes more. We sit on the porch in the evenings when the air cools, and the fireflies rise out of the tall grass. And she tells me about the early years on this land, the years before I was born, when she and my grandfather were building something out of almost nothing. Her memory for details precise and vivid, it always has been. A few weeks ago she said to me, "Your uncle thought the worst thing that could happen was for you to know what he was doing." It turned out the worst thing that could happen was his assumption that you wouldn't matter even if you did. I've thought about that on every drive back to the city since, about what it means to be dismissed for long enough that the person dismissing you stops watching, about a shoebox under a bed, about a note taped to a door with masking tape, written by a man who thought the woman inside it was already gone. The people who underestimate you always think they're being careful. They never realize that small is exactly the thing they can't see coming.